Yeah, good evening, and welcome to the lecture series Great Books. I am Nicola Glaubitz, and I co-organized this lecture together with Katharina Wesselmann. I will repeat some of these things in English because the lecture today will be in English, and I just heard that there are a couple of Anglophone people having joined us. So yeah, thanks for coming. So the lecture will be recorded and it will be available as a video, and you can see the link in the chat. The questions at the Q&A session at the end of the lecture will not be recorded. So if you feel like asking a question, open your mic, raise your hand and just ask a question after the lecture. This will not be recorded, and you will also know when the recording ends. Please switch off your video during the lecture, and if you like, you can also put your question into the chat. Yeah, thanks for joining us tonight. And let me say a few words about our topic, which is great books. That refers to significant books, but also to books that are quite literally long, fat, and large. Quite often these two qualities go together. We asked colleagues for talks about books that are both long and significant, or at least are considered as significant. The lecture series addresses books that have become culturally important, and it raises the question why they have become important and significant. That is, why did they become part of the literary canon? Asking how and why books find their way into the canon also means asking why books are excluded from this canon. For example, why are so few long books by female writers or by writers from the global south part of the canon of great books? And do the big books in the canon reflect a Eurocentric and male perspective? Can we draw that conclusion? Our lecture series does have omissions and gaps, which are partly due to our disciplinary orientation in classical studies, Katharina, and English studies, myself. But the gaps are also due to the fact that the canon of great books is precisely not what it claims to be, a prime example of world literature that represents universal values. In English, there is a very apt expression for these large format books. They are endearingly called doorstoppers. This expression indicates a possible use for fat or great books, which you don't want to read. You can use them to keep the door from banging or to keep out a draft. I hope that this lecture series will equip you with other instructions for use as well. So something in between adoring these books as masterpieces or using them for practical household purposes. Yeah, I'll hand over to Katharina now, who will present our speaker, Michelle Witten from Flensburg tonight.
Yes, thank you, Nicola. Michelle Witten is a junior professor of English and Irish literature at the University of Flensburg. She is originally from Canada, but has studied and worked in Oxford and Basel, where I had the pleasure of meeting her. And Michelle is really a great expert to have here for James Joyce. She wrote a monograph on this author, James Joyce and Absolute Music, which examines Joyce's incorporation of musical structure across his opus. Also, her other recent publications show a tendency to find new and exciting discourses in much studied authors. There's a chapter on T.S. Eliot and again music in the Edinburgh Companion to Eliot and the Arts. And there's an article on Frankenstein and hysteria, which interests me very much, and also a co-edited volume on Shakespeare and space. And of course, there are more Joyce articles and a forthcoming co-edited issue of the James Joyce Quarterly on Joyce and the non-human, which I also think sounds very exciting. Michelle's second book will focus on 19th century literature. So I hope we can invite you again next time for Wilkie Collins, for example. Thank you very much for being here, and we're all very much looking forward to your lecture. And yeah.
Well, thank you for having me. Thanks to both Katarina and Nicola for inviting me, and I'm so pleased to be here to talk and even problematize Ulysses. I'm going to start with this rather fantastic tweet. James Joyce's Ulysses is a book that has almost become synonymous with difficulty. Many people have told me that they or their parents have the book, but it's more of a shelf decoration than a book that they have read or a doorstop. As you can see from this tweet, some might even say that you need some sort of origin story or superpower in order to be able to read Ulysses. So, for example, 24 hours after the vaccine, I read Ulysses and understood it. So here we have the discourse of difficulty. But there's a contradiction here. If no one reads Ulysses, why is Joyce the second most written on author in the English language after Shakespeare? Why does Ulysses consistently appear as one of the top 100 books on any given book list? Why is there such a thriving Joyce industry? Why does Ulysses continue to be taught and continue to be considered a benchmark of great literature? These are some of the questions I hope to answer in this talk. So here's a little outline of what we're going to cover. So I'm going to do a little bit of Joyce bio, because a lot of thinking about Joyce is somehow inextricable from talking about Joyce himself as a person. I'm going to talk a little bit about Joyce's intentions in Ulysses. I'm going to give my version of a basic guide to Ulysses. Then I'm going to talk about some of the difficulties of the text, and then also critical responses and the canon. So here we have Joyce looking very dapper. But let's start with a quick introduction to the man himself. So he was born in Rathgar, Dublin, in Ireland on February 2nd, 1882, and he died in Zurich on January 13th, 1941. He met his future wife, Nora Barnacle, and they had their first date on June 16th, 1904, immortalized as Bloomsday. They went to Trieste together in 1904. They had 2 children, Giorgio and Lucia, but they didn't actually marry until 1931. And the Joyces lived in Dublin, Trieste, Zurich, and Paris. His major works, so as a Joycean, I'm very happy that there's only a few, except they are texts like Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake are quite massive. Dubliners, A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake. And then he also has some minor works, which I won't mention, but they're on the slide. Instead, I would like to read this rather long quotation about Joyce himself. And this will give you a bit of a better idea about Joyce's personality. So this is from a letter to Harriet Shaw Weaver, written in June 1921. So here we go. A nice collection could be made of legends about me. Here are some. My family in Dublin believe that I enriched myself in Switzerland during the war by espionage, working for one or both combatants. So this is not completely untrue. Both sides intercepted sirens, one of the episodes of Ulysses, and thought it was some sort of code. Triestines, so as I said, Joyce lived in Trieste, Dublin, Zurich, and Paris, seeing me emerge from my relative's house, occupied by my furniture for about 20 minutes every day, and walk to the same point, the General Post Office, and back, circulated the rumor, now firmly believed, that I am a cocaine victim. A man from Liverpool told me he had heard that I was the owner of several cinema theaters all over Switzerland. There's a slight basis in fact. Joyce did actually invest in a cinema venture in Dublin called the Volta Cinema. Mr. Pound described me as a dour Aberdeen minister. Mr. Lewis told me he was told that I was a crazy fellow who always carried 4 watches and rarely spoke except to ask my neighbor what o'clock it was. This becomes quite ironic with reference to Finnegan's Wake, where one of the crimes that occur in Phoenix Park is that he keeps asking the time. Mr. Yeats seemed to describe me to Mr. Pound as a kind of Dick Swiveller, which is a reference to Dickens's Old Curiosity Shop. Dick Swiveller is a character who always compares his situation to that of literary characters. He owes everybody money, and he's very laid back about this fact. And he's also very easily manipulated. And there are many anecdotes that I could tell about Joyce always owing people money or asking for money and being very laid back about taking money, but that's not what we're going to talk about. One woman here originated the rumor that I'm extremely lazy and I will never do or finish anything. I calculate that I must have spent nearly 20,000 hours in writing Ulysses. A batch of people in Zurich persuaded themselves that I was gradually going mad and actually endeavored to induce me to enter a sanatorium where a certain Dr. Jung, the Swiss Tweedledum, who is not to be confused with the Viennese Tweedledee, Dr. Freud, amuses himself at the expense, in every sense of the word, of ladies and gentlemen who are troubled with bees in their bonnets. So this kind of gives you a little bit of an idea about how Joyce perceived himself, what kind of rumors he felt he should be collecting about himself, and then also a little bit about his personality, and maybe a little bit also about how he interacts with others. There's a lot of stories about Joyce meeting with other famous contemporaries, like he once had dinner with Proust. It was a dinner that Proust had not been invited to, but showed up to. And Joyce was underdressed and he was drinking to conceal his embarrassment. And then according to William Carlos Williams, and also Joyce's letters and Arthur Power and Ford Maddox Ford, the two then spoke only about their health complaints because it was the only common ground that they could find between themselves, apart from a refusal to acknowledge that they had read each other's work, and also that their other common ground was that they both liked truffles. But let's talk a little bit about Joyce's intentions when he was writing Ulysses. So a lot of the time when we think about Ulysses, we do think about what Joyce said he was going to do, because this seems to be inextricable from ways in which we approach the text, which I'll talk about shortly. So here are some of his intentions. So the first quotation comes from when Joyce was speaking with the translator, Benoit Micha, who was translating Penelope, which is the last episode of Ulysses. And he asked for a scheme of the book. And Joyce only gave it to him in bits, claiming, "If I gave it all up immediately, I'd lose my immortality. I've put in so many enigmas and puzzles that it will keep the professors busy for centuries, arguing over what I meant. And that's the only way of ensuring one's immortality." And amid all of these puzzles and enigmas, there's also a desire to recreate Ireland, a kind of just add water to 1904 Dublin. So here in a conversation with Frank Budgeon, he says, "I want to give a picture of Dublin so complete that if the city one day suddenly disappeared upon the earth, it could be reconstructed out of my book." So here are two intentions. So one is to be completely incomprehensible or enigmatic. And the other is to give you a just add water version of Dublin that you could then live the everyday life of Dublin. So it's kind of a contradictory intention if you think about it. One of the difficulties when reading Ulysses is the sheer amount of correspondences in the text. So going back to this idea that he's giving a complete picture of Dublin, that complete picture is rooted in 1904. And if you don't live in 1904, it can be very difficult to understand. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a basic outline of the plot of Ulysses. And then I'll go on to talk about some of these correspondences. So Ulysses, according to Joyce, is divided into three sections. There's the Telemachia, the Odyssey, and the Nostos. And the Telemachia, it goes from episodes 1 to 3, and then episodes 4 to 15 is the Odyssey, and episodes 16 to 18 is the Nostos. So the basic plot is that it takes place over the course of one day, June 16th, 1904, and each chapter represents an hour of the day, starting at 8 a.m. There are two main characters, Stephen Dedalus and Leopold Bloom. And Stephen Dedalus is someone that we've already met in A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. For Stephen, his plot line, if I want to water it down into that, is that he's feeling usurped, he's feeling dispossessed, and he has a lot of emotional baggage about the death of his mother, and he feels that he's stagnating in Ireland. For Bloom, it's more of a human story, so to speak. He becomes aware in Calypso, which is the 4th chapter, and that's also the first time that we're introduced to Bloom, that his wife Molly will be meeting an aptly named Blazes Boylan for a rehearsal at 4 p.m. and at this point she will cheat on him. He and Molly haven't had sex since the death of their son Rudy 10 years previously. It's also a story about daily life, and it's purposely removed from all historical association, allegedly. So it's before World War I, it's before the Easter Uprising, so it's dated 1904 for this reason. Like the structure of the book, and also its title, each episode has a Homeric correspondence to the Odyssey. Each episode takes place, as I said, over the course of 1 hour, with some overlap in the first 3 chapters between the Telemachiad and the Odyssey. Each chapter is also written in a different style, and there's a juxtaposition of history, geography, culture, politics, etc. in every chapter as well. And it's interesting because also the real city has taken the story and put plaques so that the fictional characters also inhabit the real city. And it's then also, in terms of the Odyssean structure, the fact that modern characters are superimposed over the Odyssey. So I'll just quickly give a kind of a one-liner for each chapter, I'm assuming that you all haven't read Ulysses, so that's why I thought it would be a good idea to orient you. So Telemachus takes place at 8 a.m. We're introduced to Stephen Dedalus and Buck Mulligan in the Martello Tower. And then in the next chapter, Stephen is then teaching a class, and he's having kind of a rich inside life looking at his students, which I hope no professor has while looking at their own students. And that occurs at 9 a.m. He then, at the end of that chapter, has a conversation with Mr. Deasy where he discovers that information is extremely unreliable. The 3rd chapter is Proteus, and this takes place at 10 a.m. Stephen is walking along the Strand, and it's a stream of consciousness, borders, perception. These are the things that he's thinking about. Calypso is the 4th chapter. Here you're introduced to Bloom. Joyce claimed that Bloom was more interesting and that he'd abandoned Stephen Dedalus because he found Bloom to be a more interesting character, and that Stephen Dedalus wasn't a character that he felt he could build this novel around. Leopold Bloom is our Odysseus equivalent. He's the modern hero. The writing style changes. We start to get associational logic. And this is also the point where the Odyssey or the plot begins. Lotus Eaters, there's a lot of mention of flowers. There's a lot of Freudian language of flowers. It's blissful, it's forgetful, it's a chapter about forgetting. The 5th chapter is Hades. This is the funeral of Patty Dignam. Here we have juxtapositions with death and thoughts of those who are dead. We begin to understand how others perceive Bloom at this point in the novel, and we also start to realize that he's an anti-storyteller as opposed to Odysseus. And the Homeric equivalent here is the travel into hell. In Aeolus, we're in a newspaper office, which has a wonderful Homeric correspondence because Aeolus is the god of winds. And so here we have the hot air of the newspapers, the hot air of the press. And this particular chapter is written as newspaper articles. And it also takes place in the newspaper office. Lestrygonians is Bloom's lunchtime. This is in Davy Byrne's pub. We have references to food, to meat, to Plumtree's potted meat, to cannibalism. There's the juxtaposition of sex, death, and food. So these are some of the tools that are used in this chapter. Scylla and Charybdis. This is a conversation that occurs outside of the National Library of Ireland. The correspondence is to a 6-headed monster on a sharp mountain peak versus the whirlpool, where Odysseus has to decide to sacrifice 6 men. In this case, Stephen Dedalus is having a rather erudite conversation about Shakespeare and Hamlet, and that's what happens here. In Wandering Rocks, this is not a chapter that actually happens in the Odyssey, but it's because it's avoided by Odysseus. But this particular chapter happens all over Dublin, and it's framed by Father Conmee in the Viceroy carriage procession. And then a lot of characters from Dubliners actually come in. And it's the episode that Anthony Burgess describes as being the most contrapuntal episode of the book. Sirens, my favorite chapter, is the 11th chapter of the book. It occurs at 4 p.m. in the concert room. and in the salon bar restaurant of the Ormond Hotel. The story of the sirens is written as a fuga per canonum, and it's written in the language of music. It takes place at the time that Bloom knows his wife is going to be cheating on him, and we'll talk about this episode a little bit more later. Cyclops corresponds, we're almost done. Cyclops corresponds with the encounter between Polyphemus and Odysseus. And it's written in hyperbole because it's a one-eyed view, and gigantism. There's a citizen who's there, who's preaching nationalism. Bloom walks in and irritates the citizen so much that he throws a biscuit tin at his head. And that's the wonderful ending of that chapter. Nausicaa is written as a romance novel. It's also reads a little bit like a woman's magazine from the 19th century, complete with advertisements geared towards women. Bloom is wandering along the street, and then he sees Gertie McDowell, and then he masturbates. And we'll talk about this a bit more later as well. Oxen of the Sun takes place in the birthing room. The connection is to Apollo's oxen and the punishment of eating them. It's written in a parody of all English styles of literature. Circe is written as a dream play. It occurs at midnight in Nighttown. Bloom is still following Stephen around town, and he follows him into Bella Cohen's brothel. The correspondence to the Odyssey is visiting Circe's island, where the men are all turned into pigs. Odysseus goes in and Moly saves his men. Then Circe sends him into the underworld, and he speaks with Tiresias, and she also gives him advice regarding Scylla and Charybdis. Circe is meant to be a picture of the unconscious, but also of tabooed sexual practices. Eumaeus, waiting at the cab shelter, corresponds with Odysseus' return back to Ithaca, and Eumaeus was the farmer. Ithaca is Bloom coming home. It's written in a question and answer style, like an examination or an inquisition. When Odysseus returns to Ithaca, he's also given an examination about his scar. And this Ithaca is one of two endings of Ulysses. Penelope is written in complete stream of consciousness. It's meant to correspond with Odysseus' wife, who's been faithfully waiting for him, as opposed to Molly, who has in fact been unfaithful to Bloom. So there's a bit of an irony there. And it ends a bit ambiguously. We're not sure whether or not this couple is going to be okay. So now to some analysis. What makes this text so difficult? There's a method to the madness, which is part of it. But part of what makes it so difficult is how much Joyce has to say about the text. So in a letter to Carlo Lunati, which is with reference to the Lunati schema, he writes, "It is also a kind of encyclopedia. My intention is not only to render the myth sub specie temporis nostri, but also to allow each adventure, that is every hour, every organ, every art being interconnected and interrelated in the somatic scheme of the whole, to condition and even to create its own technique. Each adventure is, so to say, one person, although it is composed of persons, as Aquinas relates to of the heavenly hosts." So this refers to the Lunati schema, which is one of the two schemas that Joyce created about Ulysses. And in it, you see correspondences. And part of the difficulty of reading Ulysses is all of the correspondences. The sheer amount of knowledge that you need to have about not just all literature written until 1904, but Irish history, music, newspapers, physiology, narrative techniques, commodity culture of 1904, economics, agriculture, Dublin as a city. You have to have all of this knowledge in a way to fully understand all of the references in the text, not to forget a heavy understanding of Homer's Odyssey if Joyce's schemas are to be believed. So it's highbrow, it's middlebrow, it's lowbrow, it's everything in between. So here's an example of the Gilbert schema. And as a reader of Joyce, I know that there are some Joyceans who tell you to stay away from the schemas, but I really appreciate them. I really appreciate that it tells you, it tells you the title, the scene, the hour, what kind of organ is associated with it, the art, the color, the symbol, the technique, the correspondences. It's kind of a little bite-sized guide to Ulysses. And, and I thought I'd included both pages. So this is, and it's like this for all of the chapters of Ulysses. And there's some slight differences between the schemas, but I think it allows you to have kind of a rich avenue into reading the texts. So why is Ulysses considered to be such a difficult novel? I keep asking this question. Is James Joyce's Ulysses the hardest novel to finish? What do you do if you get stuck? And we have someone who claims to be sleeping behind her copy of Ulysses. What do? I read the guides. I read the annotations. I read the schemas. I engage as fully as I possibly can with the text. I'll show you some of my favorites. So Ulysses Annotated gives a very great guide, especially, you know, for a 21st century audience, a late 20th century audience. It tells you the things that you're not necessarily going to know intuitively. I also very much enjoy Blumiere's The New Bloomsday book. It's an episode by episode guide through Ulysses that in kind of plain language tells you what to pick up on. There is a bit of a theological slant to it, but I think it's very interesting. And it gives you a good plot summary almost. So these were the two guides that my undergraduate professor, Michael Grodin, assigned to us to read when I took my Ulysses class in my 4th year of the BA. And I've never looked back. I think that they're extremely helpful. But just in case that doesn't float your boat, there's a lot of others. So, oh my goodness, there's kind of the episode by episode guides by original readers of Ulysses, like Budgeon, Gilbert, Kenner, and Ellman. And then there's the episode by episode guides or perspectives that I think are quite useful. They also have their own slants. Like you can see, for example, Devlin and Reisbaum have engendered perspectives. There's obviously a focus on gender here. And this is also, you know, if you're stuck, there are books that you can consult. But then the question remains, should you have to consult so much outside of the book just to understand the book that you're reading? Gifford's Notes is as thick as Ulysses itself. And you know, you're kind of reading it and looking at it page by page alongside each other. And in addition to this, as you can see just from this, and this is just a selection of the guides and perspectives, some of the difficulties when approaching the text as an academic, there's a whole other set of difficulties here. As Sean Latham writes in Hating Joyce Properly, there is such a wealth of criticism to go through when writing on Joyce that the endeavor of writing on him is extremely daunting. In addition, there's the whole concept of genetic criticism, where we get very tied up in what Joyce's intentions are, his drafts, his revisions, his notes, etc. Now, I personally love this, but I can see that it kind of leads to almost a Joycean cult atmosphere. Nevertheless, I'm going to induct you into the cult. So are you ready for some genetic criticism? Here we go. All right, so I'm going to take the Sirens episode as an example, not just because it's my favorite, but also because some would claim that this is one of the most difficult episodes of Ulysses because it's so hard to follow. But this is the nature. The episode is meant to be written as a fuga per canonum. So a fugue has its roots in the Baroque period and is a rigidly structured piece of music informed by the rules of counterpoint, where the subject or orienting theme enters first in one voice and then in another. Although the structure is quite rigid, the experience of listening to a fugue is meant to prompt a fugue state or a flight of fancy. So you are meant to lose track of yourself in the music. It comes from the Latin fuga, or to flee. So Joyce claimed that he wrote the Sirens episode as a fugue. It's a very famous claim. He says, "Dear Miss Weaver, perhaps I ought not to say more on the subject of sirens, but the passages you allude to were not intended by me as recitative. There is in the episode only one example of recitative on page 12 in preface to the song. They are all the 8 regular parts of a fuga per canonum, and I did not know in what other way to describe the seductions of music beyond which Ulysses travels." So the type of work that gets done on Joyce in music mostly focuses on musical allusions, but there are some who do look at the way in which Joyce uses musical structure. In general, up until 2018, it was generally believed that Joyce had not achieved a fugue, or those who had written on the fugue tended to only focus on these first lines, or the prelude of chapter 11, starting from bronze by gold and going until begin. And they would say that that itself is the fugue, but the fugue does not exist in the chapter. I won't go into some of the more outlandish theories because that's not what I'm here for, but it was problematic that people believed that the opening sequence of Sirens was considered to be the fugue, because in 2002, the National Library of Ireland acquired a series of manuscripts. And in this, you could see that Joyce had some notes to self. And so here you see the beginning of the episode, and Joyce has written repeat phrases episode at the start. And this is significantly after he had claimed that he'd written it as a fugue. So I think one can assume that the fugue exists in the episode itself. Now, in the same notebook, which is also part of the 2002 acquisition, Joyce outlines the 8 parts of the fugue. And here you can see the complexity with which Joyce approaches the text, outlining what I've argued extensively is a double fugue. So you could, I've transcribed the handwriting next to it, and it's from the Italian. But you can see that he's intending a double fugue because you have a subject and a counter subject, and then also an exposition and a counter exposition. So that wouldn't exist unless it was a double fugue. But I know I'm going into, like, you know, some sort of random music speak, which is a tendency, I think, when you start talking about Joyce. But this, as I argue elsewhere, this particular fugue is a double fugue. Now, most critics, when they looked at this notebook, refer to this list as gibberish, but in fact, it aligns pretty perfectly with major developments in the fugue that the fugue was undergoing at the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century, when Joyce would have been writing the Sirens episode. So here you can actually see how Joyce goes about layering the double fugue. So this is kind of me going into deep genetic criticism, but this page that I've got on the slide is a page from the now earliest surviving draft of Sirens, which also contains a very early draft of the 3rd chapter of Ulysses, Proteus. So in this draft, there is a curious phenomenon of a missing bloom. The first 10 pages of the draft read much like the first 540 lines of the chapter, minus the narrative that occurs outside of Ormond Hotel. So this includes Bloom's and Boylan's progress towards the Ormond, Bloom and Golding in the dining room, Boylan going away from the Ormond towards Eccles Street. So none of this is present. It is not until the 10th page of the manuscript, when we meet Bloom for the first time, when Joyce draws a horizontal line under Father Cowley's "Let Me There." And this is right before he takes the piano away from Ben Dollard in the Love and War duet. What then follows is a series of 52 narrative fragments in this notebook, where Joyce meticulously goes through and puts crosses through them. And then he layers them into the other half of the text, showing the way in which he layers the subject and the counter subject of the fugue into the text. So my work traces the integration of these fragments to show how Joyce implements his fuga per canonum. But the question is, why is this important? Why is it relevant? Why can't you read this text without knowing this? Why do you need to know the background? Why do we get so caught up in manuscripts, notes, letters, notebooks, copybooks, typescripts? Like, why is it that we become so involved in these things instead of just reading the text for what it is? Now, as an academic, I say it shows authorial intention, it corrects a misperception of Joyce's works, it shows that Joyce was cognizant, conversant of musical historical trends, and that those then give a very nuanced picture of the literary and musical scene of the 20th century and Joyce's place in it. I say also that it demonstrates a musical project that exists throughout Joyce's works. But is it too hard? Does that make it too difficult? And this is something that I'm going to ask. I hope that you guys have some comments on. I think that this difficulty is what makes the text worthwhile in a way, but I wonder for a lay audience whether it's worthwhile. Another difficulty when looking at Joyce's text, especially in 2021, or in a 21st century context, I think can most easily be seen in the Nausicaa episode. So this is the episode that I mentioned is written as a ladies' magazine and occurs with Bloom watching Gertie on the beach. So the Homeric parallel is Nausicaa, a Phaeacian princess, who's observed during her bath by the accidentally voyeuristic Odysseus. This is transposed into Ulysses as a disturbing episode on the beach where Bloom masturbates while observing Gertie McDowell. The narrative certainly conveys a willingness to be the subject of Bloom's voyeurism, as demonstrated by its coquetry, that is also observing the rise she is getting out of Bloom. So I have a quotation here from the text. She put on her hat so that she could see from underneath the brim and swung her buckled shoe faster, for her breath caught as she caught the expression in his eyes. He was eyeing her as a snake eyes its prey. Her woman's instinct told her that she had raised the devil in him, and at the thought a burning scarlet swept from throat to brow, till the lovely color of her face became a glorious rose. The image of a potent woman teasing the middle-aged man, showing her body off, yet keeping him at a distance, is a trope that is associated with this description of Gertie. And it can be detected throughout Nausicaa. For example, later in the same quote that I have on the PowerPoint, she poses allegedly for his eyes only. At last they were left alone, without the others to pry and pass remarks. His hands and face were working, and a tremor went over her. She leaned back far to look up where the fireworks were, and she caught her knee in her hands so as not to fall back, looking up, and there was no one to see, only him and her, when she revealed all her graceful, beautifully shaped legs like that, supplely soft and delicately rounded, and she seemed to hear the panting of his heart, his hoarse breathing. So if this narrative is to be believed, Gertie is complicit in Bloom's spectatorship, and this tends to be the line that is followed in Joyce scholarship. However, in both examples, there is an element of violation that could creep into the scene. In both instances, the narration implies self-awareness and intentionality between spectator and spectated. However, objectively speaking, the events that occur are Gertie's blushes upon realizing she is being watched, followed by her leaning backwards and watching fireworks, and him, as a result, being able to see up her skirt. In other words, the complicity is in the narrative, but not necessarily in her actions. A similar connection can be made to Bloom's voyeuristic masturbation. In the famous fireworks scene, Gertie is watching the fireworks and apparently giving Bloom, I quote, a good eyeful as she leans further and further back. She leaned back and the garters were blue to match on account of the transparent. She leaned back ever so far to see the fireworks, and her face was suffused with a divine and entrancing blush from straining back, and he could see her other things too. Namesook knickers, the fabric that caresses the skin. He couldn't resist the sight of the wondrous revealment half offered like those skirt dancers, behaving so immodest before gentlemen looking, and he kept on looking. And then a rocket sprang and bang shot blind blank and oh. Then the Roman candle burst and it was like a sigh of oh, and everyone cried oh, oh, in raptures, and it gushed out of it a stream of rain gold hair threads, and they shed and they were all greeny dewy stars falling with golden, oh, so lovely, oh, soft, sweet, soft. So this is the ejaculation moment. It is only in the next half of the chapter that we discover that Gertie is disabled. And while the temptation is to believe her blushes were those of awareness rather than embarrassment, and here we have the age-old argument that genuine innocence never blushes, since blushing implies knowledge of which the blusher is ashamed, there's an implication that she is the predator and Bloom the victim of a young woman taking charge of her body and an older man, and inciting an old man to self-abuse. There are other ways of construing her final visual contact with Bloom, and this is the last sentence here. She half smiled at him wanly, a sweet, forgiving smile, a smile that verged on tears, and then they parted. It could be that she knew nothing of Bloom's activities, and she was simply acknowledging him as she was departing. It could be, as reported, that Gertie McDowell had conceived a romantic infatuation for the dark middle-aged stranger on the beach. Or on the other hand, the description wan or pale, faint, verging on tears, and the construction of a sweet, forgiving smile could also highlight the aspect of violation implicit in Bloom's actions. This is further reiterated by Bloom's "what harm?" and his subsequent victim blaming. Did she know what I? Of course, like a cat sitting behind a dog's jump. Or his "she wanted it, and look what she was wearing" justification, when he says, "Still she was game. Lord, I am wet. Devil you are, swell of her calf. Transparent stockings stretched to the breaking point." When Nausicaa was published in the Little Review in 1920, it was found to be obscene, lewd, and lascivious. And the two editors were convicted of publishing obscene matter and distributing pornography through the US Postal Service. Here, the obscenity charge was defined by Cockburn's 1868 test. I think the test of obscenity is this: whether the tendency of the matter charged as obscenity is to deprave and corrupt those whose minds are open to such immoral influences and to whose hands a publication of this sort may fall. But how do we read this lack of consent as obscene in the 21st century? Thinking of the James Joyce open letter from 2019 and the accusation that there's something in the text that promotes non-consensual behavior, for all its wonders and challenges and eureka moments, I find Ulysses to be increasingly difficult personally for reasons outside of the text, though for me the text still outweighs this. The critical response to Ulysses has been polarizing. T.S. Eliot raved about Joyce's mythical method, where he makes the modern world possible for art by controlling, ordering, and reshaping history according to a pattern that makes no more sense. Virginia Woolf deemed it indecent. Mr. Joyce's indecency in Ulysses seems to me the conscious and calculated indecency of a desperate man who feels that in order to breathe, he must break the windows. At moments when the window is broken, he's magnificent, but what a waste of energy. And after all, how dull indecency is when it is not overflowing of a superabundant energy or savagery, but the determined and public-spirited act of a man who needs fresh air. George Moore, writing in 1922, says, "Ulysses is hopeless. It is absurd to imagine that any good end can be served by trying to record every single thought and sensation of any human being. That's not art. It's like trying to copy a London directory." Nevertheless, almost as soon as it was published, it was deemed canonical. I'm going to skip the Collins review. Here's some definitions of canon. The literary canon can be narrowly defined as that which is accepted as authentic, as for example, in the context of distinguishing canonical form from apocryphal works in relation to the Bible or to Shakespeare, but is usually defined more broadly as that which is assumed to be good literature, in fact, the best literature, that which is worth preserving and passing on from one generation to the next, a great work perceived as having special value for its culture. In this sense, everything that makes Ulysses so difficult is also what makes it canonical. This can be seen in the beloved afterlife of Ulysses, where you see Bloomsdays that occur every June 16th all over the world, where Joyce's works are celebrated with the acting of passages, with music, eating Bloom's breakfast, eating Bloom's lunch, this kind of, even if you haven't read Ulysses, you can still join in Bloomsday. And thinking along the lines also in which, in which canon, the word canon has changed. I think it's also changing the afterlife and the way in which we view canonization. So for example, people today say, oh, but that's canon, or that's not canon. So for example, talking about Star Wars and how all of the pre-Disney opus is now considered to be fan fiction, it's not canon. Or talking about Marvel or DC universes or Firefly. You know, the way in which we use the word canon has changed. It used to be over time, a single book becomes a library, the library becomes a school of thought becomes a prism, the enthusiasm hardens, and then it turns into something authoritarian, as Wesley Morris writes, and who gets to decide what belongs in the canon. But canon also changes in terms of what is authentic, what counts, what doesn't count. And so I think when we think about whether or not Ulysses is a canonical work, we also need to think about what kind of image, what kind of afterlife, and what kind of difficulties and worthwhile difficulties the text pose. So that's all I have to say. So yeah, I'm curious to hear your thoughts about this. So I'm looking forward to the question period.